Yes.
So I'll be moving now to issues relating to HIV and AIDS, the department's knowledge of matters relating to HIV and AIDS, and their responses. Now, the earliest reference to AIDS in documents involving the Home and Health Department, at least in the material available to the inquiry, would appear to be a 21st of January 1983 meeting of SNBTS and Haemophilia Centre directors. It was chaired by Dr. Bell, attended by Dr. McIntyre and Mr. McBride. I'm not going to go to the minutes of that meeting, which have been considered before, but during the course of it, Professor Cash draws the meeting's attention to recent articles in the United States and some other documents, including an MMWR extract relating to AIDS. If we move forward to May 1983, by this stage, the SHHD was receiving information relating to AIDS from other sources, in particular the DHSS. Now, the inquiry has previously considered a 3rd of May 1983 DHSS minute on this subject, which enclosed a line to take and a background note which had been prepared for the Prime Minister. Now, those documents were copied to John Davis, who was Assistant Secretary at the time at the Home and Health Department. The inquiries looked at those documents previously. They included a line to take that there was as yet no conclusive proof that AIDS had been transmitted from American blood products. I'll come back to that line later. There was also a briefing note which described the risk to haemophilia patients treated with factor VIII, said they were at increased risk of AIDS, and described the risk as follows: as yet there's no conclusive proof that AIDS is transmitted by blood as well as by homosexual contact, but the evidence is suggestive that this is likely to be the case. So those are DHSS documents, but they are copied to officials at the Home and Health Department. What we see in the documents is in the days that follow those documents being provided, both administrative and medical officials work on a submission for the junior minister who had responsibility for health in the department at this time. That was John Mackay. And I'm going to go to the submission in which these issues are brought to the minister's attention. Lawrence, it's PRSE 304037. Now, it's a one-page document. We can see at the bottom that it's from J.G. Davis, John Davis, dated the 6th of May 1983. At the top, it is addressed to PS, that's a private secretary, to Mr. Mackay, and copied to a number of individuals within the department. In the introduction, Mr. Davis says that Mr. Mackay may have seen comment recently in the media about AIDS. He might find it helpful to see some briefing material on the matter prepared earlier in the week by DHSS for the Prime Minister. Those are the documents which I just described. Mr. Davis said, "We agree with the general line in the briefing. There are, however, a few Scottish points to be made. The first is about imported factor VIII. Scotland is virtually self-sufficient in factor VIII. Occasional purchases of imported concentrate are made for clinical reasons. Only a very few patients are involved." On Scottish cases, Mr. Davis said that no confirmed case of AIDS had been reported in Scotland. Any suspected or diagnosed case would be reported to the Communicable Disease Unit at Rutsham.
Yeah, as a matter of interest, the wording there is no confirmed case of AIDS. That leaves open that there may have been a suspected case.
That wording, you're absolutely right, so it does leave that open. I'm not aware from the documents that I've seen, and I believe are available to the inquiry at the moment, that there were any suspected cases of AIDS in Scotland at the time of this note, of this minute. It's an issue we might want to investigate further, but I'm at least not aware of any suspected cases that had been brought to Mr. Davis's attention or to the attention of Home and Health Department officials which might lend particular significance to the use of the word confirmed in this submission. But as I say, it's something we can looking further to confirm the position.
Thank you.
On donation policy, Mr. Davis wrote that the blood transfusion directors in Scotland are very aware of the problem and have it under constant consideration. They are currently considering, and then he sets out 4 measures. First, briefing all frontline blood bank staff to handle questions from donors. Secondly, preparing a neutral factual leaflet about AIDS and making this available at donor sessions, perhaps drawing attention to it as a follow-up to recent press and television publicity. Informal contact with representatives of the relevant gay associations. Avoiding collection in high-risk locations such as prisons or where there's known to be a high proportion of homosexuals or drug abusers in the population. Now, that final sentence there brings with it the suggestion that collection in certain high-risk locations, such as prisons, was still taking place in Scotland at this time. There's a later section of the written note which deals briefly with prisons and what the Home and Health Department understood to be the position at this time in May 1983.
Just as a matter of interest, is there any, what are your submissions as to the force of the word neutral under 3B, preparing a neutral factual leaflet? It's a word which is often used where there are 2 rival views. What do you submit the force of that is? Or is it simply saying we're trying to give the objective facts without sensationalism?
I think it's more likely to tend towards that second characterisation. So it's perhaps a slightly unusual word to use in this context. I think it's likely to reflect officials' understanding that already at this time in May 1983, there was what they considered to be a great deal of sensationalism in the press in particular around any issues relating to AIDS, and that they were keen to avoid adding to that sensationalism. It might also relate to a desire to avoid causing any offence amongst blood donors. A neutral leaflet which tries to present facts about AIDS, which doesn't go beyond presenting matters as neutrally as they could be at the time, so as to avoid causing offence. Those are 2 suggestions that come to mind immediately, sir, but it's a word that might be worth keeping in mind as we look through the remainder of the documents and when we consider documents in the written note relating to the preparation of the AIDS leaflet. What we'll see in my summary of those documents and also in the written note is perhaps less direct involvement by Scottish officials and certainly by Scottish ministers in the wording of leaflets relating to AIDS than might have been seen in England and Wales when officials and ministers were more directly involved in wording. So we see, from this document, a number of matters which will repeat and will form a part of the pattern of officials' response to the risk of AIDS. One of them in particular is an emphasis on Scotland being, as they described it, virtually self-sufficient in factor AIDS. We know that Mr. Mackay, the minister, saw this document because we have a response from his private secretary, which I won't go to, essentially just expresses the minister's gratitude for this submission. Now, around this time, and certainly by June 1983, Dr. Brian McClelland of the South East Scotland Regional Transfusion Centre had begun work on an AIDS donor leaflet. The steps taken by Dr. McClelland in relation to that leaflet have been explored in evidence previously heard by the inquiry, notably Dr. McClelland's own oral and written evidence. The Home and Health Department's involvement in that issue is set out in the written note. I'm not going to go into the detail of it here for reasons of time. The evidence suggests that Dr. McClelland's RTC in Edinburgh began issuing an AIDS donor leaflet in June 1983, suggests that the Home and Health Department had very little involvement in the preparation of its contents, when Dr. McClellan described orally to this inquiry how he went about liaising with the Home and Health Department. He described essentially asking for forgiveness rather than permission after taking steps to issue the leaflet. The documents also show that around this time, so this is mid-1983, Home and Health Department officials were monitoring the development of a donor leaflet being prepared by the DHSS and transfusion directors in England and Wales. The documents show officials in Scotland liaising with their counterparts in the DHSS, emphasising the need for the Home and Health Department to be consulted on the development of that UK leaflet. If we move forwards to the 1st of July 1983, when a DHSS submission on the publication of an AIDS leaflet was submitted to ministers in England and Wales. As we've seen with some of the other documents relating to AIDS, it was copied to an official at the Home and Health Department, that was Mr. Wassell. After that submission is copied to officials in the Home and Health Department, they begin to discuss it internally and to prepare a submission to go to their minister, Mr. Mackay. And I'm going to turn to that document now, which is dated the 11th of July 1983, so about 10 days after the DHSS submission, and it's SCGV 40/147_157. So again, from Mr. Davis, once more to the Private Secretary, to Mr. Mackay, and I'm going to highlight the second paragraph and what Mr. Davis says there. Regional transfusion directors in England have now prepared the attached draft leaflet for printing and publication by DHSS. It's substantially based on an earlier draft by Dr. McClelland of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Service. The main aim of the leaflet is to discourage practicing male homosexuals from donating their blood, and in view of the sensitivity of the issue, DHSS have consulted their ministers over its terms. Our understanding is that some reservations have been expressed and that DHSS officials are toning down the text somewhat, largely to make clear that even in the US, only a small number of cases have been reported. DHSS ministers have also asked for a formal statement to be available for use at the time of publication to diminish any risk of overreaction. Mr. Davis refers to a possible opportunity for that statement. And then in the final paragraph of this page, he said, we consider that the leaflet should be issued on a UK basis and arranging for the text to be adjusted accordingly. The main change that's required is to alter references to the national, i.e. English and Welsh, blood transfusion service. No separate Scottish announcement will be called for, but an important point for any press inquiries is that Scotland is virtually self-sufficient in factor aid. So we can see here officials recommending to the minister that a UK approach to this leaflet would be appropriate, suggesting that some changes might need to be made to its wording, but really focusing on what might be considered to be more minor amendments to reflect that applies to blood transfusion services in the whole of the UK and not simply England and Wales. And what we also see in the last sentence of this document is an emphasis, again, on self-sufficiency in Scotland. I'm going to go very briefly to the minister's response.
The underlying reason for that, presumably, is an appreciation in mid-July 1983 that the public, and for that matter others, might think that if the blood is sourced from domestic national sources, it is safer than blood products imported from the United States.
That's exactly right, sir, yes.
And making a virtue of that.
Absolutely making a virtue of that, sir, yes.
Yes. Thank you.
It might be said to be tied not only to the public perception of the risk of domestically produced blood products, but also what officials appear to understand the relative risks to be. I'll come to a document a little later on which lays out, or which provides an insight into at least what some officials understood to be the advantages that were gained from blood products being produced domestically rather than relying on imported and particularly American sources.
Yes.
So the Minister's response, which comes through his private secretary the following day, it's just a short document, SCGV 40-147_153. At the bottom, we can see it's from Jeff Pearson, private secretary to Mr. McKay, directed to Mr. Davis. It starts by simply noting that the Minister has seen the minute, and the Minister inquired whether the surplus capacity at the Protein Fractionation Centre at Liverton could be used to increase UK production of factor VIII. He believed that the current English production is only some 60% of demand. So that's perhaps the Minister taking on board the point that is implicit in Mr. Davis's document, which is that domestically produced products are understood to be of lower risk than imported ones, and wondering whether Scotland could help to pick up additional production and send some of it to England and Wales. Now, the response to that inquiry doesn't come until some months later in October, and I'll come to it. The answer was essentially no, but it's perhaps notable, sir, that the point picked up by the Minister and the concern with, or the emphasis placed on Scotland's self-sufficiency and the relative risks as they were understood at the time between Scottish and imported blood products. Now, what the documents show in the summer of 1983 is HHD officials continuing to be updated about the DHSS's approach to this donor selection leaflet, this AIDS leaflet, which was still being prepared. It was eventually agreed to be distributed in Scotland as well as England and Wales from September 1983. A separate Scottish press release was prepared at the time that that leaflet was introduced, and I'm going to turn to it very briefly. It's PRSE 302778. So we can see the date of this document, 1st of September 1983. The first paragraph introduces the leaflet that's been published. It says it's by the health departments in the UK for distribution in Scotland by the SNBTS. In the second paragraph, AIDS is briefly described, and then I was going to highlight the third, where this press release said this: no cases of the disease have been confirmed in Scotland, and the Scottish Home and Health Department emphasised today that there is no conclusive proof that the disease can be transmitted in blood or in blood products. There is, however, no screening test the BTS can use to detect people with AIDS, and donors are asked not to give blood if they think they may have the disease or be at risk of it. In the next paragraph, Scotland is self-sufficient in whole blood and virtually so in blood products. Nearly all the factor VIII issued for the treatment of haemophilia is produced from blood plasma donated to the SNBTS by blood donors in Scotland.
And that links back, does it, to the second paragraph the second sentence, where it describes AIDS as a, quote, comparatively new disease to Britain.
That's exactly right, so yes, yeah. So we can see that link being made, we can see the emphasis on self-sufficiency again, we can also see the use of the no conclusive proof line without a qualification attached to it on whether or not the disease was likely to be transmitted by blood and blood products. It was in October 1983, the next month, that Mr. Davis provided a response to Mr. Mackay's query about whether the PFC could produce additional factor VIII for England and Wales. The response is summarised in a written note. I won't go to it now. The short answer was no, or rather, at least no, not for the time being. We move into late 1983 and the first half of 1984, and the department's officials, based on the documents, appear primarily to have been monitoring developments related to AIDS and blood products, including proposals for further steps that might be taken in response. Now, that included consideration of updates to the donor leaflet, changes to distribution arrangements. There's some reference to the possibility of small pool products, blood products being prepared, some reference to surrogate screening for AIDS, monitoring of AIDS cases, monitoring of the DHSS approach. HHD officials' involvement around this time often seems to take place by attendance at different meetings, in particular attendance at meetings of SNBTS directors, also attendance as an observer at meetings of transfusion directors in England and Wales, and we've summarised what we can get from the documents in the written note. I'm going to move forward fairly quickly, so to August 1984, when the Home and Health Department became aware that a haemophilia patient living in Scotland had contracted AIDS, and the minister was informed. Lawrence, could we please go to SCGV 40/147_073. So the date of this document is 29th of August 1984. Again from Mr. Davis, and again to the private secretary, to Mr. Mackay. Mr. Davis wrote this: "We've recently heard that a Scottish resident, haemophiliac, has contracted AIDS. We have hitherto reported that Scotland is virtually self-sufficient in factor VIII, the blood product used in treating haemophiliacs, and therefore that there was no risk to Scottish haemophiliacs. This case may appear to provide contrary evidence and may possibly be so reported by the press. We're informed that the patient concerned has only recently moved to Scotland. He has hitherto been treated in Newcastle, where imported factor VIII has probably been used. The disease takes some time to manifest itself, and the Scottish product is not implicated." Now, a number of points which arise from this document. One of those that's most notable is perhaps the way in which the risk arising from PFC factor products was described and appears to have been understood by Mr. Davis. We've hitherto reported that Scotland's virtually self-sufficient in factor VIII, and therefore that there was no risk to Scottish haemophiliacs, rather than perhaps a reduced risk compared to other blood products. Perhaps also of interest in the final sentence of this document is what seems to be a reference to the incubation period. In AIDS, the disease takes some time to manifest itself, which will of course be relevant to an understanding of the risk posed by factor products. That's August 1984. I'm going to turn now, and I've moved fairly swiftly through this period. Of course, there are a lot of important developments that take place that are set out in the note. I'm going to move forward to the department's response to the discovery that a group of patients treated with PFC factor VIII had developed antibodies to HDLV3. This group of patients sometimes referred to as the Edinburgh cohort. Now, the inquiry's already heard evidence on the timing of this discovery from witnesses like Professor Ludlam, Dr. McClelland. I'm not going to repeat it. What that evidence would appear to suggest is that Scottish haemophilia clinicians and the SNBTS started to become aware of this development around or by late October 1984. Now, the precise date on which the department's officials first became aware of the results of the Edinburgh patients is not entirely clear from the documents. The earliest one we have involving the Home and Health Department is dated 20th of November 1984, and it's a minute from officials to the Minister, and I'm going to go to that now. It's SCGV 401447_058. Now we can see the date at the bottom, 20th of November 1984. It is from Hugh Morrison, who was Under-Secretary at the Home and Health Department at the time, which was a grade higher than Assistant Secretary, effectively Mr. Davis's superior. Addressed to the Private Secretary, to Mr. Mackay. You can also see that it's copied to the Private Secretary to the Secretary of State, so involving the Secretary of State in this development. Now, in the first two paragraphs, Mr. Morrison gives an update on leaflets in particular, in AIDS developments in relation to the AIDS donor leaflet. I'm going to draw your attention, sir, to the second half of this document, and in particular the paragraph that begins a development. And Mr. Morrison wrote this: "A development of particular concern in Scotland is that 16 Scottish haemophiliacs have been identified as having antibodies to the virus HDLV3, which is implicated with AIDS. The presence of the antibodies indicates that the patients have been exposed to the virus, but does not mean that they will necessarily develop AIDS. A batch of factor VIII, the blood clotting agent given to haemophiliacs produced at the Protein Fractionation Centre at Liverton, appears to be implicated. As factor VIII is produced from plasma recovered from blood donations, it must be assumed as probable that the batch was contaminated by a Scottish donor. The batch has been withdrawn, and the SNBTS are taking vigorous steps to identify the source of infection. This, however, will not be an easy task, since blood from many donors is used to produce a single batch of factor VIII. In the meantime, work is urgently proceeding to introduce heat treatment for factor VIII in order to kill the virus and to develop a screening test for HDLV3 antibodies. No such test, however, is likely to be readily available in the immediate future." And then the final paragraph: "It would not be appropriate at this stage to issue any statement on the discovery of the antibodies in the Scottish haemophiliacs. Suitable defensive briefing has, however, been given to SIO. SIO is a reference to the Scottish Information Office." If we go over the page, we can see the first page of the briefing that's referred to in Mr. Morrison's note. As you can see, it's in the form of a Q&A. I'm not going to go through all of this document now. I'm going to highlight, please, the second half of this page, which is of particular relevance to this discovery. It says antibodies in Scottish haemophiliacs. Antibodies to HDLV3, the virus which it is believed caused AIDS, have been discovered in 16 Scottish haemophiliacs. A batch of factor VIII produced at the Protein Fractionation Centre at Liverton is implicated, and then underlined, no statement is to be released on this at present. If, however, there are specific inquiries from the media on this matter, the following material should be used. There's then a series of further questions and answers, and we just go to the last page and the final entry, which is prefaced with "only if pressed," so it appears to be directed at those who may need to answer press inquiries or inquiries from others and are being pressed about this issue. What should Scottish haemophiliacs do? Answer: they should make inquiries of the consultant treating their case. If we could go back, please, Lawrence, to the first page of this document, and the top, the manuscript edition. Now, this manuscript edition would appear to come from the minister, Mr. Mackay. It says this: "Thanks. While I fully appreciate that a statement would give rise to great concern among haemophiliacs, and indeed among recipients of blood generally, I do not want us to be accused of a cover-up. If we are approached, we must be perfectly open." And then the question: when is heat treatment likely to be ready?
One of the curiosities about this particular document, if we just have a look back at thank you, is what is said in the last couple of sentences in the third paragraph. In the meantime, it says work is urgently proceeding to introduce heat treatment for factor VIII in order to kill the virus and to develop a screening test for HTLV3 antibodies. No such test is, however, likely to be readily available in the immediate future. This is the 20th of November. There was a record in the 15th of November. The reference, for those who are interested, is DHSC 302309_055, which in the Department of Health recorded a screening test for HIV in blood products had been developed, and a pilot scheme was due to start shortly. The cost was to come from existing RHA budgets of about £2 million. So, almost a week earlier, not quite, the position in London, at least, had been appreciated that there was a test in the wings, although it might take some time to go through its pilot process, etc. It's perhaps curious that there's no mention of that in this memo to this minister, who is concentrating, therefore, on heat treatment.
That's absolutely right. So that is a curious feature of this memo. We'll come a little later to look at what information was provided when to ministers in Scotland, in particular Mr. Mackay, about HDLB3 screening and when it might be introduced. And in doing so, I'll seek to answer your question from this morning. But you're right, sir, that there's no reference to that information that you've just described from
what
the
it
DHSS.
At the moment suggests to me, and this is open, of course, to submission and maybe entirely wrong, is that those who had come by some knowledge of developments in England haven't necessarily been in regular and constant touch with those in Scotland who are dealing with the same issues.
That's right, sir. I'll make sure I get the timing right when we get to HDLB3 screening. From memory, by January 1985, we see information sharing between the DHSS and the SHHD. It could be that at this time, November 1984, we weren't quite there yet in terms of information.
Well, there may well have been sharing of information, but it may not have been comprehensive.
Yes. So as we've seen, there is a query from the minister about when heat treatment's likely to be ready. A further minute is provided from Mr. Morrison on the 26th of November 1984. I won't go to it now, but it outlines developments in trials of heat treatment of PFC factor 8, suggests when PFC heat-treated factor 8 is likely to be introduced, says that will be the beginning of 1985. As for press statements, in this minute, Mr. Morrison wrote, Mr. Mackay's point on publicity about antibodies is well taken. We are keeping in close touch with the blood transfusion service on the matter, which has not so far been picked up by the media. So this is late 1984. The inquiry has previously considered some of the consequences of the time that passed between this discovery being made, that Edinburgh patients had developed antibodies to HDLB3, the time that passed between that discovery and patients and their families being informed. One of the consequences, it might be said, of the time that it took for that information to be shared and to become public knowledge was that public discussions of the safety of PFC factor 8 at this time, late November 1984, took place in the absence of that information. I'm going to turn relatively briefly to a newspaper article, PRSC 303234. Now we can see the date of this article in the top left, thank you, November 28, 1984. The title gives a good indication of what the article is about. Good Scottish blood lessens the risk of disease. I'm not going to go through all of it, so unless that would assist, I'll just highlight a couple of parts. We start with the introductory paragraphs. Not one person has contracted AIDS in Scotland as a result of blood transfusions or treatment with preparations made from Scottish blood. That's no nationalistic boast. It's a tribute to the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, who from the first outbreak of AIDS here about 2 years ago went on the alert for high-risk donations of blood. Now, it might be noted that first paragraph might be strictly true in the sense that what's happened is that it's been discovered that patients have developed antibodies to HDLB3 rather than developed AIDS. But it might be thought nonetheless that there is a disconnect there between how the risk is described in this introductory paragraph and what was known about the risk from PFC factor products by this point. And if we could zoom out, please, Lawrence. And then the left-hand column that's headed caring, just want to highlight the first paragraph there. Thank you. Professor Ronald H. Girdwood, President of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and Chairman of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association, the donor's representative body, says, I think the public should be reassured. I do not think people in Scotland have anything to worry about, whether they are getting blood transfusions or other treatments with blood products. Thanks, Lawrence. That's all I wanted to cover with that document. Now, the following day, 29th of November 1984, a meeting took place with representatives of the HHD, the SNBTS, and Haemophilia Centre directors in Scotland to discuss issues related to the Edinburgh patients. The meeting also discussed positive test results in haemophilia patients elsewhere in Scotland who had been treated not simply with PFC factor 8, but also with imported factor 8. I won't go to the document, but it was chaired, that meeting, by Dr. Bell, attended by other HHD officials. The meeting note described discussion of what were termed very difficult ethical problems, including whether to tell patients and their relatives of the results. About a week later, the 5th of December 1984, the minister was updated again, and I will go to this one. It's PRSE 303032. So this is addressed again to the Private Secretary, to Mr. Mackay, copied to the Secretary of State's Private Secretary. It's dated the 5th of December 1984, and it's from Mr. Davis. Now, in the first two paragraphs of this minute, there's a summary of the meeting that I just described, which took place on the 29th of November. There is then, in the third paragraph, that begins from the figures available, a description of the position as it was then understood to be by officials. From the figures available, it appears that out of the approximately 400 haemophiliacs in Scotland, and actually if we could perhaps zoom in on this paragraph, Lawrence. Thank you. No more than about 10% have antibodies to HDLB3. Only other countries themselves self-sufficient in factor VIII can match these figures. We understand that in England, where there's more reliance on imported factor VIII, the incidence is therefore considerably greater. In the United States itself, the great majority of haemophiliacs will have the antibodies. It should be stressed that although antibodies to HDLB3 are believed to be a precursor to AIDS, their presence does not necessarily mean that the individual will develop that disease. Knowledge remains incomplete, but the current medical view is that only a small proportion, probably less than 10% of individuals with antibodies will subsequently contract AIDS. If we go to the next paragraph, there is a reference to recent press articles describing the position as it was understood by the press in Scotland. And then this. No statements can be made at the moment until the haemophilia directors resolve the very difficult ethical problem of what action to take with regard to their patients about the matter. Reference to the position in England and Wales, and then briefly, just over the page, the top of the first paragraph on this page, the Blood Transfusion Service believe that they've now identified the donor responsible for the contamination of the batch of factor VIII. And then in the final paragraph, the ministers informs that the PFC has started heat treating factor VIII. The first batches are now being issued for trial. A plan for all Scottish produced factor VIII to be heat treated by the end of January. So that's the 5th of December, 1984. Mr. Mackay's private secretary responded the following day, on the 6th of December, relaying that the minister hoped that the blood transfusion service in England and Wales had been informed about this donor who'd contributed to the contaminated batch so that they could decline his blood if offered. We move forward again to the 12th of December, 1984, when Home and Health Department officials were informed that a journalist from the Yorkshire Post had learned about the Edinburgh patients and intended to publish an article, but also that the journalist had agreed to postpone publication until the 20th of December. I'm going to go to a document in which the minister's response to this development is recorded. It's PRSE 301293. Now, the date of this is the 12th of December. It's from Miss Teal, who's private secretary to Mr. Mackay, addressed to Mr. Davis, copied to various others, titled AIDS Yorkshire Post Inquiry. The first paragraph records that Miss Teal had discussed this issue with the minister, and then goes on to say that Mr. Mackay is firmly of the opinion that we should not make any announcement at this stage before those concerned have been told that they have been affected. He does, however, feel that it is now absolutely imperative that every effort should be made to inform the haemophiliacs or their parents, as I understand that some of them are, in fact, children. Mr. Hoy, who was an official in the Scottish Information Office, tells me that if the Yorkshire Post do decide to follow up this story, it is not likely that they will publish it before a week tomorrow. It would therefore seem obvious that every effort should be made to inform the people concerned as soon as possible, and definitely by the beginning of next week. In the meantime, Mr. Mackay feels that we should respond to any press inquiries with the line that we have identified various people with the problem, that we are taking steps to inform them, and that in the meantime, it would be extremely distressing for these people, particularly the parents of children, to read about it in a newspaper, not forgetting that press publicity on this before the people have been informed could stir up a totally unnecessary scare amongst the 400 haemophiliacs in Scotland. Now, the meeting between patients and their families and haemophilia clinicians was organised for the 19th of December 1984. In the lead up to that date, we can see, and around that date, we can see the department's officials working on a press release to be issued at the same time as the publication of the Yorkshire Post article, which was expected on the 20th of December. I'm going to turn briefly to that press release. It's PRSE 40225. We can see the date at the bottom is December 20th, 1984. The title is New Measures to Counter AIDS. The Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service has announced today that all Scottish-produced supplies of Factor VIII have now been heat-treated to counter HDLV3, the virus that can cause AIDS. Factor VIII is the blood product used in the treatment of haemophiliacs and is supplied to the NHS in Scotland by the SNBTS, so leading in this press release with developments related to heat treatment. Then in the second paragraph, reference to the Edinburgh patients. This move follows the recent discovery that 15, and I should say, so by this point it had been clarified that it seemed that 15 rather than 16 patients were affected. That 15 Scottish haemophiliac patients treated with a particular batch of Factor VIII have developed antibodies to HDLV3. It's suspected that the pool of plasma used to prepare this batch of Factor VIII contained blood from a donor who'd been exposed to the virus. The batch has since been withdrawn. There's then, in the remainder of this press release, reference to the understanding at the time that developing HDLV3 did not necessarily mean contracting AIDS. And then the problem is much smaller than in most other countries because in recent years, Scotland has become virtually self-sufficient in the production of Factor VIII and has imported very little commercially produced Factor VIII, which carries a greater risk of transmitting AIDS. And just finally, before I leave this topic, picking up on the dates there, this is December 20th, 1984. In the introduction to this section, I suggested that haemophilia clinicians and the SNBTS became aware of the results of at least some of the Edinburgh patients in late October 1984. We know that the HHD's officials and the minister involved were made aware by 20th of November 1984. So that was all I intended to say about this particular issue relating to the Edinburgh patients and their discovery. I'm going to move on fairly quickly, because we've got a lot else to cover, to the introduction of screening for HDLV3. Now, as a broad brush summary, what the evidence suggests is that by the summer of 1984, HHD officials had begun considering the introduction of an HDLV3 screening test, had begun to become aware that a screening test was being developed. The written note summarises their involvement in these developments in the summer and autumn of 1984, including their contact with the DHSS about the creation of a UK working party to consider the issue. Now we can see DHSS and SHHD officials corresponding directly during this period. The document I intended to take you to, sir, in which we can see that happening, comes from January 1985, and it's when DHSS officials provide a copy of their ministerial submission on the introduction of HDLV3 screening, rather than anything earlier than that. What we see in the documents is HHD officials, both administrative and medical, looking at that submission, beginning to consider the recommendation that they should make to Scottish ministers. Now, the actual DHSS submission has been considered by the inquiry previously, and for reasons of time, I'm going to avoid going to it, but I'm going to instead focus on the response of the department's officials to this development in England and Wales. The first is a minute from February 1985. It's at PRSE, 3 zeros.
Can you just help me with this? A little earlier this morning, I drew attention to the fact that the minister wasn't told clearly that a screening test might be in the wings and undergoing pilot tests in England, and wasn't informed of that by his officials. You're now telling me that there have been discussions in the summer and autumn of 1984, including contact with the DHSS in London, updating on the progress that science was making towards developing the screening test, which had been, after all, anticipated when Dr. Gallo made his announcement that he discovered the cause of AIDS back in April. So, what was the state of the knowledge of screening of HDLV3 amongst the officials in Scotland, and at the time the minister was briefed? Did you have any information?
I hope that the documents we're about to look at will help our understanding of the knowledge of Scottish officials on that particular issue. The time the minister was briefed would appear to be the minister in Scotland, the 21st of March 1985. I'll also come to that document.
Well, yes, but the document I drew attention to earlier was in November, I think, wasn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
20th of November, I think. And if that is so, then what you're telling me at the moment, what you've told me, you're summarising, you're moving forward, I appreciate, to 1985, but you were summarising the knowledge that had been developing in the department in Scotland in the summer and autumn of 84. I just want to understand what that broadly was. Was it that a test was about to be trialled, a test could be used? They must have appreciated that there was some form of screening if the Edinburgh cohort had, after all, tested positive for having antibodies to HDLV3 in their blood. What was the position?
Most of the documents, at least that we've summarised in the written note, and it may be that we can look at this further, seem to suggest a fairly high level state of knowledge. There's one document which might help, sir, from August 1984, which I could bring up now, which
Yes.
gives some insight into this issue. Lawrence is SCGV 40147079.
You mean underscore 079?
I'm sorry, underscore 079 is what I mean, yes. So it's a 16th of August 1984 minute from Dr. Bell to Mr. Murray in the department, and it's titled Testing a Blood Donation of AIDS. Dr. Bell said this: I have information the research and development work in London is proceeding with the objective of introducing a screening test for HDLV3, the putative causal agent of AIDS. Intensive work in this field is, of course, also going on in the United States, suitably encouraged by commercial motivation. Dr. Cash has already indicated to Mr. Davis that additional revenue costs have to be foreseen for the introduction of an AIDS screening test for blood donations. I think Dr. Cash's view that resources for this purpose will be needed in the year 1986 to 87 is probably right. The BTS in England are already addressing themselves to this problem, and DHSS is in the picture. Until more information about the cost of a new test is available, we can only work on the estimates already given by Dr. Cash. An example of a document which might be suggested to illustrate a high-level sort of knowledge, an anticipation that a screening test was being developed and would eventually be introduced, not at least from this document, an understanding that that was going to happen imminently.
Yes, I mean, the other curiosity, I suppose, is that you can tell me, in the documents you've been looking at, has there been any reference to the article in the Lancet on the 1st of September 1984, which was reporting on North London, but plainly they'd conducted a fairly wide screening of people who were haemophiliacs being treated in North London, and had discovered that 34% of them were positive for antibodies. So that might have suggested that there was a test available, at least for the researchers. Plainly, it wasn't a general screening test. But not any reference to that in the Lancet article at all in any of the material that you've looked at?
Not that I can recall off the top of my head, sir. We will double check and we will find out whether there are any references to that article. If I can put it this way, it sounds like the sort of article that I would have picked up and included in this section of the written note if it had been referred to, but we will double check the position and see if we can find any reference to it.
Yes, thank you.
So if you do want to get a clearer picture of this time period in the second half of 1984 and what the understanding of SHHD officials was, it may be worth looking briefly at a December 1984 SNBTS directors meeting, which was attended by officials from the Home and Health Department, where there was an update on where matters had developed in the introduction of a screening test. Lawrence, it's PRSE 301767. So we can see 11th of December 1984, a meeting chaired by Dr. Cash, attended by Dr. Bell and Mr. Murray. And if you could zoom back out, please. Go over the page. Over the page again, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to identify the entry dealing with screening.
Yes,
so it's the second half of this page.
It's when Dr. McClelland reports back on the meeting he's been at in the late November.
That's right, sir, yes.
That was the 27th November 84 meeting he was reporting back on.
27th November 84, that's right. And we've made reference to a note of that meeting, which Dr. McLennan believes that he prepared, although I think it's not very clear from the document itself who prepared it, but Dr. McLennan believes he prepared that document, which recorded that he could get no clear picture of when or how a serviceable essay will be provided.
Yes.
So suggests a good deal of uncertainty at this time about the timing of the introduction for this screening test. And just in this document, there'd been unanimous agreement to test all donors once an antibody test was available. The matter of how to counsel and take care of antibody-positive donors was acknowledged to be a very difficult problem. All of those documents together appear to suggest the department's officials being aware that work was ongoing to introduce a test, but a good deal of uncertainty about when a screening test that could be used to screen blood donations, and in particular for routine screening of blood donations, would be available. So that's late 1984. We get into January and February 1985. So January 1985 is when a copy of the DHSS submission is provided to officials in the Home and Health Department. And we can then see how the contents of that submission and developments in England and Wales are discussed by officials in the department. If we could go, please, first to PRSE 301054. Now, this is another minute from Mr. Davis, dated the 7th of February 1985. It's to Dr. Scott, copied to a number of other officials in the department. It begins with the following. DHSS ministers have now agreed, and added in manuscript, apparently with great reluctance, that all donations of blood in England should be tested for the presence of antibodies to HDLV3. We now have to decide whether we have any alternatives to advising our ministers that it is necessary to follow suit in Scotland. There are over 250,000 donations of blood in Scotland each year. As far as we are aware, only one donation to date has contained antibodies to HDLV3. We now require a signed statement from all potential donors that they're not in one of the at-risk categories for contracting AIDS. Hence, the number of infected donations, already vanishingly small, should decrease still further. There's then reference to some guidelines prepared by the ADCP. And then, staying in the same paragraph, haemophiliacs in Scotland are now not at risk. I think that should say at all. Sorry, I'm so sorry. It's right as it is. Haemophiliacs in Scotland are now not at risk as all factor VIII is heat treated. The situation in England is different. In any case, only a proportion of those with antibodies develop AIDS. I've seen figures ranging from 10% down to several hundred. There's some discussion in the next paragraph of the implications of introducing a routine screening test for blood donors, reference to any test inevitably being imprecise, problems created by false positives, a suggestion there may always also be false negatives. The next paragraph, if I can summarise, deals with the potential financial implications of introducing a screening test as they were understood at this time. In the middle of this paragraph, Mr. Davis said, "I've discussed the problem with Mr. Robertson, who's in the finance department, and though the financial angle cannot be ignored, we're both agreed that it should not be the determining factor in this case." In the final paragraph, the first sentence, it seems to me that the balance of rational argument would be heavily against introducing a test on all donations. I accept, however, that there's little rationality to be seen where AIDS is concerned. So that's the view of Mr. Davis in February 1985. I'm going to briefly turn to Dr. Scott's response to this minute, which is PRSE 303846. In the first paragraph, Dr. Scott says that Mr. Davis's minute summarised clearly and succinctly the problems associated with the routine testing full donations of blood for HDLB3. And then the third paragraph, from a cold, objective scientific viewpoint, the case for the introduction of a test for HDLB3 antibodies in the present state of development and without being properly validated is not clear-cut. There's no doubt, however, that there is a lot of public interest and we are liable to be carried along on the rising tide of emotion. We're in a particularly difficult situation in that DHSS ministers have agreed, however reluctantly, to the introduction of the test. It is I think that should say, it is most unfortunate that a policy decision on this matter was not made at a UK level, though understandable given the degree of public and media hysteria. Further down the page, just the first sentence of the penultimate paragraph, Dr. Scott said, in the end, I think we shall have to put up a full submission to ministers, pointing out the issues as summarised in your minute and the distortion of priorities that will arise, though in the end saying, we doubt if they have an option. So one example here, as well as the issues particular to HDLB3 screening, one example of how the relationship between decisions taken by the DHSS and the SHHD may have played out. A suggestion here from Dr. Scott that it was going to be necessary for Scotland to follow a decision which had been taken in England and Wales. There's a further response to Mr. Davis's minute, which I'm not going to bring up, from Mr. McPherson on the 11th of February 1985, makes similar points, accepts a lot of what Mr. Davis says, but then comments, I very much doubt if we can hold this line now that English blood donations are being tested. Comments, the pressure on us to follow the English example will be irresistible. The following month, on the 21st of March 1985, after work by medical and administrative officials took place on the preparation of the submission, it goes to the Minister. We'll turn to that now. It's PRSE 404593. PRSE 304593. Now, the date of this is the 21st of March 1985. It's from Mr. McPherson in the department. It's addressed to both the Private Secretary, to Mr. Mackay, and to the Secretary of State. Headed AIDS, it covers two broad issues. The first is notification of AIDS. I'm not going to look at that issue any further. If we go through to the next page, please. To the bottom half of the page, the heading that begins blood transfusion. There's reference to some of the backgrounds to this submission in paragraph 6, in particular reference to the Edinburgh patients, reference to the introduction of heat treatment in Scotland. In paragraph 7, some more detail on tests. Mr. McPherson wrote, tests are becoming commercially available for the screening of blood donations for the presence of HDLB3 antibodies. The first of these tests from the USA was marketed in the UK at the beginning of March. DHSS ministers have agreed in principle that in England all blood donations should be screened and that regional health authorities should meet the cost of this. There's then reference to an article that appeared in The Lancet from Professor Cash and others supporting the introduction of HDLB3 screening, but on the basis that it took place after evaluation of tests before they could be introduced for routine screening of blood. Over the page, this is a long document, so I'm not going to go through all of it here unless that would assist. But what we see in the first few paragraphs of this page, the submission developing, first of all, by describing the risk as it was understood by officials at the time, some of which reflects the minute from Mr. Davis that we saw earlier. Mr. McPherson wrote, as noted above, all Scottish factor VIII, this is in paragraph 8, is heat treated. The risk from ordinary blood transfusions is believed to be very small. So as far as is known, in Scotland, where 280,000 donations are collected each year, there's only been one infected donation of blood, the one which contaminated the batch factor VIII. There's other evidence that blood donated in Scotland is clean, and donors are now required, before giving blood, to sign a statement that they're not in a group at risk of contracting AIDS. In the next paragraph, a description of what was understood at this time about the screening tests themselves and some of their drawbacks, in particular a high rate of false positive results, maybe 4%, an unpredictable false negative rate. In the next paragraph, some discussion of the financial implications, though again in the middle of paragraph 10, the point is made, nevertheless, we should not wish to stand in the way of testing solely on financial grounds. In paragraph 11, a description of what was understood to be a potential problem, which is at-risk individuals presenting themselves to the blood transfusion service in order to have their blood tested, and the need to set up alternative testing facilities for such individuals. And then finally, in paragraph 12, the conclusion and the recommendation, no doubt there will be public pressure for routine screening of blood donations once it's known that commercial tests are readily available. However, having regard to A, the limitations of currently available tests, the disproportionate effect of a high rate of false positive findings, and the need to provide alternative screening facilities to divert at-risk individuals from the blood transfusion service, we recommend the adoption of a phased policy leading to the routine screening of blood donors, which would take into account a comparative evaluation of the tests available, the need for ready access to testing facilities out with the transfusion service, and a recognition of the considerable requirement for additional testing, monitoring, and counselling of donors with positive tests. We should be glad to know whether ministers agree that we should proceed in this way. So that was how this issue was put to Scottish Office Ministers on the 21st of March 1985, and how the evaluation programme was described. At this point, so I'm going to try to answer the question that you asked me earlier, which came about in the context of the statement from Alexander Murray. It may be helpful if we quickly go back to that statement, PRSE 302440. And then to page 4. And the start, thank you. The sentence, I believe the Scottish ministers were told about the evaluation programme at this stage. Mr. McPherson's submission, and the references given, refers to this. Now, from the preceding paragraphs of Mr. Murray's statement, it looks like he's referring to a period around the 21st of February 1985. The submission he's referring to here from Mr. McPherson is the one we've just looked at, 21st of March 1985. So when Mr. Murray referred to Scottish ministers being told about the evaluation programme at this stage, appears to be referring to the period leading up to and around the 21st of March 1985, or at least sometime between 21st of February and 21st of March. So I hope that assists with that question from this morning. Very briefly, the response from Mr. Mackay to Mr. McPherson's submission, PRSE 40850. So not the easiest document to decipher immediately. The date of this is the 22nd of March, 1985. We get that from about the middle of this page. It refers at the bottom to Mr. McPherson's minute of 21st of March and includes comments from the Minister. He said, "I fully appreciate the logic of this advice, especially the danger that at-risk men may use the transfusion service as a screen, and as the test is not absolutely reliable, some blood may enter the system which is infected. Whatever we do on the BTS, Recommendation 12C is essential. Recommendation 12C related to the need to introduce alternative testing facilities for at-risk individuals." The Minister added, "Also, we do have to keep in line or ahead of England, otherwise we would be subject to very severe criticism." So I note the time. We're getting close to 1 o'clock and we started a bit earlier than we might otherwise have. I have a relatively small amount left on HDLB3 screening, and I'm hoping to speed up a little bit as I move through the remaining topics I hope to cover today. Would it perhaps be a convenient moment for a break now, and we could pick up the end of HDLB3 screening after the break? There are
roughly how much more have you got to do on HDLB screening? Roughly.
Roughly, I would say about 10 minutes or so, I'd hope.
It's the or so bit. Right. Okay. Well, let's do that at 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock, shall we?
Thank you, sir.
So 2 o'clock.